This is our video for week 2 of the overall process map for handoffs and communications for the entire hospital. Picking up from where we left off, we started this week with discussing other departments as the patient is transferred from their unit to other departments for surgery or other types of procedures. While we went through this process, we also found that we needed to add women's health as well as going straight from the emergency department to surgery. So to begin with that, I'm going to work through the additional admission process that we have here on the bottom, which is a patient goes from the ED to surgery. So those steps that include are the attending requires a consult, the triage nurse or PA will see the patient, that RN or PA will create a plan with the MD for the patient. Some issues that we have here are urgency of the patient, not everything available to the RN, and then also scheduling, especially with regards to the weekends. The MD places the order, and then our intention is that the patient should go to PACU for surgery, but that may not always be the case. So what we have here is the patient goes straight to the OR, and the issue that we have there is there's no medications, antibiotics could be missed, and there's no checklist that could be followed throughout that process. And then execution of the orders. Due to the patient traveling from the ED to the surgery area, there could be a hiccup there as well. Then we have patient goes to the other departments, so those are the two options. So an issue with this is patient goes to the ED, to the unit, to back to surgery. That rapid flow for the patient can create issues in communication and can get different information missed. Then we also have different views in Epic. So because different roles throughout the process have different views, there could be missing information throughout that process. Then we have the patient transferring either to surgery, PACU, or other departments. And then that brings us back to surgery. What we have here is MD places orders and RN is notified in several different ways. So some issues that we identified there. Patient notification that surgery is needed. So we think that there's definitely a hiccup in how that patient is notified. They could find out several different ways. There's issues with the consent being finished in time for this procedure. We have different specialties have different needs in rounding. Notification to the nurse. The nurse can get notified in several ways. Orders / no orders getting released to surgery. Then we have the floor to OR and floor to OSC if it's an ortho case. And then within surgery, we have report between floor and surgery as an issue, patient not ready, prepped for surgery, and no pre-op orders. From surgery, we then have the patient being transferred out. This is something that we identified as one of the better process flows throughout our hospital, and the group identified that as probably our best practice for that handoff. From here, that patient goes to PACU or phase 2, and then we have the PACU calls the receiving unit on arrival, and there's usually a 10-minute warning. The patient is then transferred by PACU to the RN and CNA. If ICU is needed, surgery contacts the house soup and the circulating RN and calls to report to ICU, and then the patient goes for regular care. For cardiology, what we've identified as a gap is the hospitalist and cardiologist communication. For the process flow, we have a patient could come from the ED to the cath lab, RN to RN bedside report. We felt that this was a good process. Or if it goes from the patient goes from the floor to the cath lab, the RN calls the floor for report. Then we have the RN notifies the floor RN procedure is complete and brings patient back to unit, RN to RN report. One of the gaps that we have here is waiting in the room to give report. And then the patient is transferred back to their unit. What we have next is women's health, which is a slightly different overall process for our hospital. So what we have here is the patient came through the ER. The triage nurse uses the algorithm to determine how to place the patient. One of the gaps that we identified here was the algorithm is not a catch-all. So if the patient comes in with something other than that's related to their pregnancy, that's where we can have some issues in the process. ED brings the patient up to women's health, or women's health goes down to get the patient, and then the patient is transferred to women's health. Something we identified here too for women's health oncology, we're going to be treating that process as similar with the same issues for the other procedural departments. So that's just a disclaimer that we have here. Then the patient care team follows the patient through the entire stay. Due to the nature of women's health, that team really just has changeover a shift. Otherwise, that team follows the patient through their care while they're here. That being said, if the patient has a complication, they travel to another department. And then one of the gaps we have here is needing a consult as a gap in communication, so to contacting that hospitalist that's on call. And then we have them transferred to the other departments. So after identifying all of that, we then go back to our other departments, and then our imaging and radiology process is imaging is ordered and shows up on the work list. Imaging calls the unit for a report from the RN, transport staff, pull the patient and bring them back. So that's our overall. We don't have specific issues that we've identified with that. There are some related to the overall process that we put at the top that I'll go through after this. So we have our patient back in their rooms, and so the next step for us was kind of focusing on patient discharge. So as we talked through patient discharge, the first at the top we have who does instructions for the patient, triggering goals of care, so specifically around therapy, who owns the plan of care. Oftentimes there is no clear plan of care. The hospitalist to hospitalist communication plan of care/discharge, who is coordinating care between specialties, physician communication, communication with family, contacting specialties for orders rather than attending, delay in palliative care consults, medication errors for discharge, and then yellow highlights on the med lists, which don't actually translate to anything helpful on the med list, and then handoff to the primary care physician and communication. So that's what we identified for patient discharge. There were several issues we also identified throughout this process that we deemed were holistic and happened several points throughout this overall process flow. We decided to put those at the top. So what we have is weekend scheduling. This is with regards to different specialties and different procedures. Something around our respect, understanding, and trust is, do we actually assume good intent? And even if we do, what is the definition of that? Who is the decision maker? So how do we determine who the decision maker is for that patient, and how are we communicating with them? Too many modes of communication. Throughout the process, all of our different team members are communicating to each other through different modes of communication, whether that's secure chat, phone calls, etc. And then we have a few of the yellow notes here. So we have expectation to react immediately for report. So understanding what those expectations are for report. Fear of response or lack of understanding. We have negative response from nursing, reluctance to talk to each other. Minus reporting is punitive. Rounding participation and expectations. And then we have the RN can't leave a patient to receive a new patient. So we felt that those were showed up quite frequently throughout the process, so we did put those at the top. And just as a reminder, the color of the sticky notes for this are reflective to our culture of safety feedback. And what we have is the yellow sticky notes are for respect, understanding, and trust. The pink are med list, workload, and timing. Blue is communication, and green is for workflows. If you'd like more additional details on the first half of this process, please reference the first video that was in this series. All we did here was replace to match the colors.